Let's jump straight into some really fascinating source material you've brought us. It's all centered around creativity, inspiration.
And specifically this framework called Redefineimaginify.
Right. So what's the mission for this deep dive?
Well, the goal is really to go beyond just listing points. We want to unpack what this framework actually suggests about how imagination gets sparked.
How creative thinking gets going.
Exactly. And what that actually means for you, for how you might approach it.
What strikes me immediately looking at this is it's not just a random collection of tips, is it? It feels more structured.
Definitely. It presents a way of looking at creativity, framing it around this idea that different inputs are the fuel for your creative output.
Which is a perspective that, yeah, it pushes you past the obvious stuff, the usual suspects for inspiration.
Exactly. It gives you a lens, sort of a way to view your own creative process and maybe actively look for the things that feed it.
So we're going to explore this framework. We're thinking about it in 3 stages, or maybe like sessions.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
We'll start with what we can sort of piece together about the introduction, the foundational ideas. Session 1, let's call it.
Right, the inferred beginning.
And then we'll dive right into the core material you shared. Session 2, which gets specific about external triggers and inputs.
Yep, that's straight from the source transcript.
And finally, building on a question posed right there in the source, we'll look at the more conceptual side, the internal processing. Session 3.
It's like a journey, right? Understanding the premise, then finding the fuel, then thinking about the engine inside that uses it all.
Let's unpack that beginning then. Session 1. How this framework is likely introduced based on what we can infer.
Right, these are the foundational ideas setting the stage. First off, just introducing Redefineimaginify as a specific thing signals its purpose.
It's here to explain.
To analyze and explain what sparks imagination and what gets creative thinking going. It's positioning itself as a guide.
And right from the get-go, the emphasis is squarely on inputs.
The core idea is understanding how all these different inputs fuel the creative output. It shifts focus immediately from the mysterious output.
To the input, which feels more tangible, more controllable.
Exactly. It makes creativity feel less like this passive gift and more like something you can actually influence by managing what you take in.
And it promises specifics, not just vague ideas.
Yeah, it says it gets into specific points, moving beyond just like abstract notions about being creative.
That's a key difference, hints at practical stuff. And, as we said, it's a framework, not just a list.
Right. That implies connections, a structure. These specific points fit together somehow.
Into a larger understanding of how it all works.
It's a model, really, not just bullet points. And the intro seems to suggest this model will challenge you a bit.
How so?
Make you look beyond the usual suspects for inspiration, suggesting that creative fuel might be in places you wouldn't normally think to look.
Okay, so the setup is specific, structured, focused on inputs, concrete ideas, and maybe looking in unexpected places. That groundwork leads us perfectly into session 2, the heart of your source material.
The external triggers and inputs.
This is where it gets really practical.
Yes, this is where the framework points you to actual places, actual practices for gathering that fuel.
And the first one is maybe a bit surprising: disruptive environments, liminal spaces.
The source explicitly mentions places like airport terminals, train stations, those in-between places.
Which can feel kind of chaotic, sometimes draining. Why would those be good for creativity?
Well, the reasoning is fascinating. In those spaces, your usual routines, your mental anchors, they're kind of suspended.
You're not in your normal groove.
Exactly. Your mind isn't locked into its typical patterns. And that freedom, it argues, allows it to wander and make connections you wouldn't normally make.
Ah, so it's the disruption itself, breaking the pattern.
Precisely. It's about breaking that habitual mental state, not necessarily about comfort.
That makes a lot of sense. But then what about the opposite, like nature, which feels calming, not disruptive?
The framework covers that too. It talks about relaxed openness, often found in nature, linked to something called effortless attention.
Effortless attention. How's that different from just spacing out?
Think about the source examples. Watching waves or clouds. You're paying attention, but it's not focused, problem-solving attention. It doesn't require hard mental effort.
Right, that feeling of just observing, no pressure. And why is that state good for creativity?
According to the source, this kind of attention reduces mental fatigue. Your brain gets a break from focused tasks.
Okay.
And this opens up cognitive space for imaginative thinking. So you've got disruption, shaking things up, and relaxation, creating mental space.
That's a really neat pairing. Different environments offering different kinds of mental freedom. What about the actual stuff we take in, the content?
Right, the inputs themselves. This is where it introduces narrative cross-pollination.
Sounds a bit academic. What does that mean in practice?
It's about deliberately seeking out stories, visual styles, ideas from really different areas. The example in the source is pretty striking.
The sci-fi and Renaissance art one.
Exactly. Reading some dense sci-fi and then immediately going to look at, I don't know, Renaissance art.
That feels like whiplash. Why force such a clash?
Because the framework argues, forcing your brain to deal with these really different forms and ideas, that's what creates new pathways and new insights.
Insights you wouldn't get otherwise.
You just wouldn't get them. It's the clash, the sources, the collision of different creative ideas that's actually productive. It's not just about variety. It's about the friction between very different things meeting in your mind.
So it's the processing of those clashing elements, and that must shape how the framework sees creativity itself.
Absolutely. It positions creativity less as pulling something out of thin air.
That magical idea.
Yeah, and more fundamentally as a process of synthesis and transformation.
Bringing things together, changing them.
But critically, this process needs those rich, varied inputs to work. You can't synthesize or transform nothing.
Right. That totally reframes it. Seeking out diverse stuff isn't just prep work, it's part of the actual creative act, which leads to the mindset it encourages.
Exactly. It suggests you need to become a curator almost for your own brain.
A curator, like in a museum, but for experiences and information.
Being a curator of inputs means, one, being mindful of where you are and what state of mind those places encourage, those liminal spaces or nature spots.
Environmental awareness.
And two, actively, intentionally seeking out that diverse art and diverse stories. It's a conscious strategy, combining environment and content choices.
So session 2 really maps out the external landscape, where to go, what to consume, and the source leaves us with a big question at the end of this bit.
Yeah, a really thought-provoking one.
It asks, basically, is creativity mostly about finding the right external triggers? Or is it really about building up our internal capacity to actually do something with all those inputs?
That question is the perfect bridge, isn't it? It signals the external isn't the whole picture. It points inward.
And that question is exactly what sparked our thinking about Session 3, exploring the internal landscape of creativity. These are ideas building on that prompt about the internal stuff that complements the external triggers.
Yes, shifting focus from finding inputs to working with them inside.
So the first key point here is simply acknowledging that internal landscape. It's not just what you consume or where you are.
But what happens inside your head? It's about balancing the external hunt with developing internal skills.
And the first internal skill is attunement.
Yeah, cultivating attunement, being in tune, basically.
In tune with what?
With those potential creative sparks, developing a heightened sensitivity to the connections those inputs might offer. It's a kind of mindset of receptive observation.
So not just passively taking things in, but actively engaging, being open.
Exactly, like fine-tuning your internal antenna to pick up the signals from the stuff you've curated, being present with it.
I like that, internal antenna. What about point 3, cognitive elasticity? Sounds stretchy.
It's about mental flexibility, cultivating an internal flexibility that allows you to hold seemingly contradictory ideas simultaneously.
In your own mind, like holding the sci-fi and the Renaissance art ideas together internally.
Precisely. But now it's happening inside, allowing those different concepts to coexist, maybe even crash a bit within you, because it's that internal friction.
That lets new connections emerge.
That's the idea. Accepting and working with that clash and collision within your own thinking. It takes a willingness to sit with maybe uncomfortable combinations.
That feels like real mental work, letting those collisions happen instead of just dismissing one. What about the quieter side of internal work?
Right. That brings us to embracing internal processing time, often called incubation.
The idea that your brain works on stuff in the background.
Exactly. The framework suggests this silent subconscious work is crucial. You feed your brain the diverse inputs, you allow the internal collision.
And then you step back.
And let your mind do its background processing. This is often when those genuine insights surface, seemingly out of the blue. But they're really the result of that unseen work.
Giving your brain time and space to work it out and wrapping up this internal side.
Ultimately, it leads to becoming a master of internal processing.
Moving beyond just being the curator of external stuff.
Yes. The real magic the framework suggests, the internal alchemy, happens after the inputs are gathered. It's about developing those internal skills. Attunement. elasticity, allowing incubation to effectively transform that fuel.
So you go from just collecting resources.
And being skilled at turning them into something new internally.
Wow. So tracing this whole Redefine Imaginify path. Session 1 lays the foundation inputs are key. Session 2 gives specific external strategies, places, content curation, and Session 3 pivots to the crucial internal skills mindset, processing needed to make it all work.
It really provides a structured way to think about fueling creativity, looking both outward at what you take in and inward at how you cultivate your own mental workshop, so to speak.
Yeah, it shifts things from just waiting for inspiration to strike
To actively building a system, both external and internal, that encourages those creative sparks.
And that leaves us with a really interesting final thought, building right off the source's own question. If creativity really needs both sides, diligently seeking rich external inputs and cultivating that internal capacity to process them, where do you, listening now, feel your own creative process puts most of its energy?
Are you mostly focused on finding the next interesting input, the next experience, or are you also intentionally working on developing your internal skills, that attunement, that flexibility, that processing time, something to really chew on as you navigate your own creativity?